Hello and welcome to The Big Picture. The Indian foreign policy over the last 65 years have seen many twists and turns in tune with the global scene. From Jawaharlal Nehru to Dr. Manmohan Singh, most prime ministers have taken keen interest in moulding the foreign policy of the country. From Nehru's Panchsheel and non-alignment to Look East policy, reviving relations with US and China, Indian prime ministers have been at the helm of pursuing these policies. Dr. Manmohan Singh has also given a lot of importance to foreign policy and has brought about major improvement in relations with the United States and China in particular. Addressing the Indian diplomats yesterday, the Prime Minister has enunciated his own 5 principles of foreign policy and sought a fundamental reset of the policy. How necessary is it to make this fundamental reset? How should we be going about it? What are the obstacles in achieving the aims enunciated by the Prime Minister? And how achievable are these principles? We will discuss all this today with an experienced panel of guests. I have with me Salman, Haider, former Foreign Secretary of India, Rajiv, Sikri, former Secretary, Ministry of External Affairs, Prof. Swaran, Singh, Chairman, Center for International Politics at the JNU, and Vinod Sharma, Political Editor, Hindustan Times. So welcome to all of you. Mr. Haider, you think there is a need for a fundamental reset?
Well, reset is a concept which I don't quite fully understand. It is not part of our normal vocabulary, but I think if the Prime Minister is pointing to a need to clarify certain issues, to make it make our interests and our priorities clearer, then I think certainly that is desirable and welcome.
Which areas do you think these priorities need to be made clear?
Well, the 5 areas that the Prime Minister himself has defined, of course, we have to pay full attention to them. After all, he is at the helm of affairs. It's his ideas that must prevail. So we have to try and understand which direction he would like to see policy proceed. But I do see a sense that there are very broad themes that he has identified.
Yes.
He's not come down to nitty-gritty, to small ideas. And I think this is in a sense, a reflection of India's own position, its own expanding range, its own expanding connections globally, and to segment them in a particular way, the way in which has been done so as to make them sort of manageable and understandable, whether in 5 or 6 or whatever. In this case, we've got 5 areas. I think that is helpful, but the broad point that has struck me more than any other is that each of these points really relates to India playing a larger role internationally and acknowledging that India's interests have expanded beyond the parochial into a kind of global setting.
Right. Mr. Sikri, India's interests have expanded, there is no doubt about it. But do you think we have been responding to those expanding interests? We have been expanding also expectations?
Well, this is something on which I myself have been thinking, and I actually 4 or 5 years ago I wrote a book, a subtitle of which is Rethinking India's Foreign Policy.
Right.
So I do believe that in the 21st century we do need to rethink how and where we are headed. But what I found missing in the Prime Minister's enunciation was, I think, an insufficient attention to the security dimensions. I feel that we need to, in the first instance, secure our frontiers. So the neighborhood has to be very, very important. And he did not mention that. On the other hand, he talked about secularism.
He has mentioned security. In fact,
but it's only in the last one, a global environment.
We should be prepared to work with the international community to create a global economic and security environment beneficial to all nations.
Yeah, but it's a global security.
But as Mr. Haider said, he's enunciating on broad issues and not really talking
Well, I believe that India's foreign policy first has to relate to India's security interests, and that means the neighborhood. And that means, how to handle terrorism. That means, the state of our relations with our neighbors could be much better than what it is today.
Obviously.
So I would have thought that more attention should have been focused on this issue is that how do we ensure that we make our neighbors willing partners in our growth and progress? How do we ensure our security? How can we be more magnanimous without being the ugly Indian? How do we treat them with respect, or do we treat them,
Not be a big brother.
not be a big brother, And ultimately, if we are large and we are much, much larger than all the neighbors combined, then we have to behave like a leader, not like a bully, but like a leader, so that we command that leadership role. That, I think, is something which I would have liked to hear from the
Mr. Haider, would you like to quickly react to that before I go to others?
No, I think what Rajiv is saying about the great importance of the neighborhood is a point well taken. Everyone would agree on that particular one. Whether more could have been said or less should have been said, on what particular shape that would take, is a matter, I would say,
detail?
Detail or of sort of rationalization. But this is a very important area, and I thought, like you, as you mentioned, that it was actually referred to in one of the points,
yes,
in terms of looking at the regional issues.
He doesn't talk so much of regional as much as global.
Yes, that's right. But
so is that a problem? Mr. Sikri feels
I
that
see no contradiction. Whether the presentation would have benefited from a more specific reference to regional and neighboring issues with neighboring countries is another question. I personally feel that it's not excluded, but I haven't seen the full text of the speech, incidentally.
We haven't seen the full text.
Well, just one quick point.
Yes.
I think that it would be difficult for India to become a global player unless we have a region where we are working in harmony with all our neighbors.
Swaran Singh, you think that this? Do you agree with Mr.
I think it's interesting
Sikri,
to
because
see.
we are having problems with our neighbors.
Yes.
Out of two major neighbors,
Yes.
straight away we have a problem.
Indeed, that could be seen, the fact that we have had difficulties with both China and Pakistan as one of the triggers in this new formulation. And if I could briefly look at the evolution which is cyclical in Indian foreign policy, is that first Prime Minister Nehru used to locate Indian foreign policy at the global level.
Right.
And the complaint was that he was not really looking at the neighborhood.
Right.
And then you saw Mrs. Indira Gandhi and Rajiv Gandhi having a foreign policy rather focused on the neighborhood. And then, of course, we were into crisis management, crisis for a long time. And what you see now happening is a couple of legacy speeches of Prime Minister. And he's not talking of reset in the future. He's talking of UPA's reset in last 9 years. So in some ways, it's an attempt both to skirt away from the immediate problems in the neighborhood and to plug it at the level which is regional and global. And, of course, look at also the linkage with domestic and linkage with economic. So in some ways, I look at this as an attempt to give a legacy speech and then sort of reset it over a longer span of period of 9 years, and saying we have really, let us say, redefined, reoriented Indian foreign policy in a certain fashion. And there are areas, of course, where this is true. And there are areas where, to some extent, the reset has been a success. I would say the example of the nuclear power generation, which has, sort of suddenly made the whole criticism of India as a weapon developer disappear, and we are looking as a very attractive market for foreign players.
Right.
Some of the areas like this, or resetting of the foreign policy vis-a-vis China, where the relationship is clearly asymmetric, is being underlined in our foreign policy, which explains how we explain certain skirmish on the border, saying it's an acne on a beautiful face, it's a local incident. It's a clear underlining understanding of the elite today in power, saying it's an asymmetric relationship, it's not a parity relationship, we need to reset here. Reset with Pakistan likewise. Where again we are saying let us continue talking at all levels.
So your interpretation is that this speech of the Prime Minister is more about what he has done than what has to be done.
The reset that he has achieved over 9 years is what he's indicating.
Vinod, is this? Do you see this as something which he is trying to tell the country and the world that this is what we have done, or do you think that he's setting some, he's laying a path for the future?
Well, of course, it's both, but it's trifle late in the day for him. He's into the final lap of his tenure, his second tenure. And I remember that along the way, in the middle of the UP's tenure, a special division was set up in the Ministry of External Affairs, Public Diplomacy.
Right.
And I thought it was a very creative move. I wonder whether it has fetched the dividends it was desired to. That to explain foreign policy to the people. The biggest problem in terms of foreign policy initiatives in India today is that there is no consensus within India on our foreign policy, be it the neighborhood or be it our relationship with China.
Right.
In fact, both Pakistan and China, with whom we have a very, we have a very complex relationship, I mean, to use the safest word, have become an internal part of the Indian political discourse, where political parties, depending on their convenience, resort to Pakistan bashing or China bashing, which indeed
Sri Lanka bashing.
which indeed, of course, Sri Lanka
Lanka
bashing now, which indeed is an extension of the biases inherent, ideological biases inherent to our public discourse. Say, for instance, that in my view, the CPM is often thought to be embarrassed by cocking a snook at China, by presenting China as an enemy country, by telling people that India should give a robust response to China each time there is a border violation. Which I think is creating expectations I don't think our size or our might is capable of fulfilling. And with Pakistan, I have never seen, in more than in recent years, the kind of Pakistan bashing which is happening in our country. It is almost similar to what used to happen in Pakistan continues to happen there. So I think that India's foreign policy requires a consensual backing domestically if it has to succeed beyond our borders.
Mr. Haider, in fact, it's a very important thing. You people as diplomats, both of you have worked, functioned as, how important is this, domestic consensus as far as foreign policy is concerned, and how does it affect diplomacy itself if there is no consensus?
Well, consensual positions have never existed. I think that we should not hark back to an ideal state that never actually existed. There will be and there should be, to my mind, differences of view. There should be a clash of ideas. There should be and this has in fact been the case from the earliest days of independence. But a broad tendency, a broad agreement on where the nation stands and what is in the nation's interest emerges from such a debate and a discussion with internal discussion.
But isn't it difficult for you diplomats when there is this thin consensus or less consensus?
Well, I think that
is that a challenge
for diplomats who have to pursue a certain policy line and express that and deal with the consequences and so on. It is obviously easier if there's the clash of opinion is not such as to prevent the government from taking a clear position.
Right.
Now, I think that one can say, but in my experience, I must say, while there has been plenty of differences of view, I haven't seen the government being stymied and being able to proceed effectively, notwithstanding.
Mr. Sikri, another issue, because I want to touch upon several issues. One of the issues is about how the regional forces within the country, the regional political forces within the country, having different, pulling Indian foreign policy in its own directions, like we are witnessing right now when it comes to Sri Lanka or Pakistan or Bangladesh or things like that. How does it affect? And do you see that being addressed in this in what the Prime Minister says?
No, it is not addressed, but it is a very important issue because India has changed, the context have changed, the players and stakeholders have increased. You talked about the states, very important. There's the businessmen, there's the media, there are Indians abroad. There's so many stakeholders in this. Now, I think it's instructive here to look at what Mr. Nehru was doing 50 odd years ago. he had a system of regularly writing to the chief ministers, to talking to them, so that he would explain what he's doing and why he's doing it, and number two, get their feedback. So whatever policy he formulated took into account all that. That I think has been missing here, and this is not something which the public diplomacy division can do. This is something which has to be done at the political level.
Right.
And, for example, if Ms. Mamata Banerjee feels aggrieved, the Prime Minister or the Foreign Minister at least has to speak to her. It's no good sending the NSA there.
Right.
Or if Jayalalitha has a problem, it has to be tackled at a political, because these are political issues.
Right.
And that, I feel, is not being done, and this is a great weakness in the conduct of foreign policy over the last few years.
Okay. Swaran Singh, some of the things, one of the things which the Prime Minister has laid out as part of his own, as some are calling his own Panchil, is about espousing democracy and secularism and things like that. And he says that we should have very strong relations with those countries which espouse these two major principles. Is it a practical thing?
Absolutely. I think that this is, as was being referred to earlier. In fact, Jawaharlal Nehru seriously believed that he had to explain his foreign policy to farmers in a small town. That was a far more utopian idea at this stage, but foreign policy over years has become far more critical element of Indian politics. Partly because India is seen as emerging, seen as far more influential. We have now 24 million Indians abroad. So it's a very different India, as was being said, that foreign policy becomes far more interesting area domestically. And to develop domestic links to foreign policy, either through public diplomacy or through political initiatives, or using Indians abroad, or using business connections or democratic slogans, these are all what fundamentally diplomacy, what it does is uses leverages which we have. So if democracy is a great leverage India has, it would really privilege that leverage to use it in diplomacy, and diplomacy is always a two-level game, which is that if when you're interacting, you're not only convincing the other parties, you're also convincing your domestic stakeholders at the same time. So as foreign policy becomes far more interesting area for Indian politics, for Indian democracy, diplomacy becomes far more useful operationalizing instrument of that foreign policy. It clearly means that linkages with domestic will increase. And we have to appreciate the fact that over years, we have also shifted far away from one family, one party, one person rule to lots and lots of regional multi-ethnic politics coming in.
That is the challenge.
Traditionally, we had upper house where provinces were supposed to influence foreign policy, but now in coalition politics, coalition partners are very critical, and therefore I think, as Ambassador Sikri said, political initiatives, not just administrative instrumentation or mechanisms to facilitate through public diplomacy what people think of foreign policy, but also taking political initiatives to build confidence with political constituents, whether they are in the south when it comes to foreign policy or they are in the east when it comes to Bangladesh policy. It is going to be increasingly important because foreign policy is becoming far more important than it was before, and therefore it has to be political initiatives in some of these areas, and that is clearly being underlined in the speech.
Vinod?
Well, when I talked about public diplomacy, I said it because I think that some degree of education of the people on foreign policy issues is an essential prerequisite to policy making.
But who should do
because
it? Who should do it? Is the question.
Well, that has to be done.
Whether it should be done at the official
public
bureaucratic level or at the political level.
Will have to be done on an institutional basis by the Ministry of External Affairs. Yes, of course, Ambassador Sikri is right that the government has to reach out to the states, especially those that are bordering our neighborhood, in order to educate them and take them into confidence. But the problem arises that the kind of partisan politics that you have in this country, that in future too, whichever government, regardless of its composition, its nature, its shape, these governments are going to be in dire difficulty, given the kind of rhetoric that is now being used on foreign policy. I'll give you an example. In the elections, in the previous assembly elections, especially in the Gujarat election, Rahman Malik was here in India. He was visiting India, and it was sought to be suggested as if the Prime Minister has gift wrapped you know, a particular issue and has kept it on the table and is just waiting for that man to arrive so that they can hand it over to him and he takes away with him back home. Now, what my question here is that should the political class in this country, in the interest of India's global standing and its interests abroad, you know, after all, as Ambassador Sikri rightly says, unless we are a regional power and accepted regional power, which inspires confidence, we have little hope to become global players. You have to first win over the region where we live. You know, now for us to say that, for us to have an adversary relationship when it comes to public discourse, it never used to happen the way it is happening now in India. It used to happen in countries like Pakistan, where there would be political parties, they would say that we are going to put our flag at the Red Fort, you know, once we win the elections. Now it is happening in India. I think that some degree of sobriety, some degree of restraint insofar as foreign policy is concerned, even in public engagements, is required. And how do you do that is something political parties have to decide. And the Indian intelligentsia, especially the foreign policy experts in this country, have to perhaps talk about it, because even the think tanks I see are bitterly divided. I mean, there are think tanks in this country which are basically urging and pleading, you know, a lot of egoism.
But Vinod, as Mr. Haider was earlier pointing out, we need to have different voices and things. Mr. Haider, in fact, you know, one of the things which we are all talking about, one of the points which he has made is about, Prime Minister has made is about investing in building connectivity with the other countries within the Indian subcontinent. He talks about it. It is not that, you know, he has ignored that. But the problem now is, as Vinod was pointing out, you know, this kind of differences of opinion, differences of thing, that should, you know, to what extent does that affect what the Prime Minister's vision is of the future?
For instance, Sir Creek is going to be given away to Pakistan. Mr. Rahman will come and take it. You know.
It can be, differences can be crippling and inhibit action.
Exactly.
I don't think we have reached that stage in India. I don't imagine we will reach that stage in India. Certainly the risk can be there at specific moments and on specific issues. But as a general way of conducting foreign policy and something affecting the conduct of foreign policy, I don't think that we have crippled ourselves. I don't think that we have developed a kind of internal debate that prevents us from participating effectively in international affairs.
Okay.
Let me say one thing.
Yes.
I think differences are not a matter of choice. Differences are given. How do we manage them? How do we maneuver over them? An example of Indo-US nuclear deal where there were very clear, open differences. Differences need not always stop foreign policy from achieving what it wants to achieve, and differences have to be managed. And I think it's a good reflection of multiple opinions being on the table, that it sort of makes you develop some ideas which are possibly going to be far more convincing in long run. I mean, it might slow you down slightly, but differences for me are given, and you can't just say, do we have a choice or not have a choice?
So unfortunately, differences are expressed in a manner as if you want to stall a particular initiative. There is no expression of differences by way of alternative thinking. I mean, I have not seen one, say for instance, the enclaves issue with Bangladesh. It is merely, it's just being stalled because somebody else wants to come to power and take credit for it. You see, and I think that serious doubts are cast on India's ability to deliver on promises it makes internationally.
But the bill was not even put in Parliament.
No, anyway, that's what I'm saying. For that reason,
Mr. Sikri,
for that.
You had a question or
no?
Well,
final words because we are running out of time.
I just wanted to take up this Indo-US nuclear deal, which is a very important thing.
Yes.
Firstly, it is up to the government of the day to build a consensus,
right,
because they are driving the policy.
Absolutely.
And they have to build it. So that is the primary responsibility. In the case of the nuclear deal, they did not do it. They thought that everyone else was giving a wrong point of view or erroneous point of view. Now, had they told the BJP, which is the principal opposition party, that look, what we are doing is a continuation of what you have done, And we can jointly take the credit, but no, it had to be Dr.
That's what the
Manmohan Singh
credit
foreign policy-
and that created a problem because you then got into all kinds of tangles. You sold it as an energy project when it was actually a strategic partnership, and now it has fallen through the cracks because you told one thing to the people, you told one thing to the Americans thought another thing. This is a classic example of how not to conduct foreign policy.
Mr. Haider, last words to you. So, how do you conduct foreign policy finally?
See, I think it's the business of the government to govern.
Right.
If you're clear about what you wish to do, and there should be clarity about aims and purposes, then I think other considerations fall into place. One might run into roadblocks and may have to defer certain important issues, but the basic direction of policy would not be compromised if there was clarity of vision, and as indeed there has been by and large in India right from the start. And so I don't
Foreign
think that
policy has been a less
at
contentious
risk.
area.
We are not
In
at
Indian
risk, to my
politics, if
mind,
you
of
see issues.
things going wrong.
So, but my question, last question to you is it necessary for a government to share the successes of its policy? Is in foreign policy, as Mr.
I think
was
it is
pointing out,
important.
is it important, and is it possible in the current
Well, of
in
course,
the current political situation?
any diplomat, even a former diplomat, would be happy to see the foreign policy issues expressed and pursued in a non-partisan spirit.
Okay. I think on that note we need to end on a non-partisan spirit. If we can only hope that there will be some non-partisanship as far as foreign policy is concerned. But the major challenges which are facing right now, which the government is facing, which we'll have to see how it will be resolved. Thanks to all my guests, Mr. Salman Haider, Rajiv Sikri, Swaran Singh and Vinod Sharma. Please keep watching. We'll come back with another issue in Big Picture same time tomorrow.